Hi everyone, I'm Dr. David Bernstein, and I wanted to welcome you back to our series, 25 Tips for Working with Modes. Now last time we learned how to talk the talk, how to speak the mode language of a side of you, or a part of you. And today we're going to learn how to walk the walk, how to intervene with modes, and particularly when modes are triggered right now in the present moment. Well, how does that work? Well, to choose the right intervention, you have to start by observing the mode, right? We've emphasized this before. It all starts with observation. So now you observe a mode that's active right now in a therapy session or on a ward. And the idea is to adjust our interventions accordingly. Different kinds of modes require different types of interventions. And the kinds of interventions that we use are really based on what those modes need. Let me give you a few examples, and these examples are, again using images from our iModes tool and from our emotional needs tool. So let's start with the first one. Here we see an abandoned child mode on the left, right? A side of the patient that's feeling, sad and, left behind, maybe even desperate. Now maybe you observe this mode in a session where suddenly the patient, becomes tearful, becomes very upset because he or she feels as if they've been abandoned, or maybe they really have been abandoned. Or maybe you observe this on a ward, a patient, sitting alone in the corner or sitting alone in their room. Now, if you just look at this image, what does this evoke in you? What is your natural inclination to do when you're faced with a side of a person that's feeling, in a lot of pain, a lot of emotional pain, feeling very vulnerable? Well, our natural inclination is to be there for that person, is to, provide for some of what that person's needs at that moment, and that is attachment. The person may need comfort or support or closeness or nurturance, right? It's very intuitive. And so, this is the kind of thing that we would do if, one of our relatives or friends, was, feeling terribly vulnerable. It's exactly the same thing we would do, try to provide for some of what they need. And this is exactly what we try to do with a patient when they're in this kind of mode. Okay, now that's pretty intuitive. Let's go on to the next one. Now, what about a patient who's angry or angry at you? A patient who maybe feels that you've done something wrong, you've hurt them, committed some kind of injustice, and they're angry at you. Maybe they're really angry at you. Well, as long as it doesn't go too far and cross your boundaries or turn into an attack on you, what a patient needs, what we all need when we're feeling angry, is for somebody to listen and take us seriously and to give us the room to get the anger out, to ventilate the anger, right? Because remember, the angry child mode, this is a kind of protest mode. And so, what we need to do is to allow that person to make that protest as long as it stays within certain acceptable limits and boundaries. And once they've gotten the anger out, then we can empathize with, let's say how they're feeling, or some of the realistic aspects of what they're angry about. Now, there may also be some unrealistic or distorted, aspects of how they're perceiving the situation, what they're feeling is unfair or unjust. But if you first let the person get the anger out, then empathize with the realistic aspects of their perceptions and with their emotions, then it's much more easy to get them to see what may be somewhat out of balance or unrealistic in their perceptions. Okay, now let's go a step further. What about when, the patient's anger crosses a line into aggression? What about when a patient threatens us or intimidates us? Or imagine that there's another mode that involves, putting us down in a disrespectful way. In other words, what do we do when patients' modes lead them to cross boundaries? Boundaries involving safety, boundaries involving respect. Well, again, it's pretty intuitive. What people need when they're in these kinds of modes is limits. We need to set limits on them. And actually, those limits help them. They help them to contain themselves. And eventually they can internalize those limits that we set, and that helps them to develop a sense of self-control. Okay, so setting limits when a patient's in a mode that crosses our boundaries is really crucial. Okay, now here's our last example. What happens when we see a mode like this? Right? Here's the detached protector mode. What kind of need is associated with this mode? Well, frankly, we don't always know. This is a mode that blocks out feelings, makes distance from us. And very often in that moment, it's hard to know what that underlying need is. What's the child mode that's, hidden behind this wall? Does this person need, maybe the person underneath needs attention or needs support and so forth. But at that moment, they're not letting you come close to that vulnerable side. So, what do we do? Well, intuitively, imagine that you were with a friend and you came to visit that friend, and your friend uncharacteristically was being kind of distant. Not in a hostile way, but just, you were having a hard time making contact with him or her. What would you do? Well, I think what you would do is try to approach that person in a gentle and respectful way and call attention to this side of them. If you're not using the mode language, you say, hey, I'm just noticing you're just not quite yourself today. What's going on? You seem a little distant, right? And if we use the mode language, as we learned last time, you'd say, hey, I see a side of you right now that seems kind of distant, kind of detached from your feelings, right? So in this case, because we can't perceive directly, we can't feel directly what the patient's need is, we begin by, in a gentle and respectful way, kind of mirroring the patient's mode, calling the patient's attention to the mode, okay? And then we can take it from there. Okay. Now, so far what we've seen is that, if we can observe the mode and identify it correctly, it's kind of intuitive then how we adjust our interventions in working with these modes. And, in my experience, this is going to work as long as we're coming from an authentic place, right? So, imagine that, in the heat of the moment that, right now, for whatever reason, it's hard for me to truly empathize with somebody when they're in a vulnerable child mode, or I don't feel comfortable in setting limits on somebody. That's going to be harder. But, adjusting our interventions, to meet the patient's mode is really a matter of, an expression of our own authenticity. It's a matter of kind of being grounded in our own emotions, staying in contact with the patient. And if we can come from that place, then usually these kinds of interventions work. Okay, now, pretty intuitive, right? But on the other hand, modes are not always easy to work with in the here and now, even if we know what the right intervention is to use. And so, modes can sometimes switch, people can rapidly flip from one mode to another, or sometimes people can be really stuck in a particular mode and it's hard to get them out. So what do we do then? Well, that brings us to our next video, which is tip number 6, dance the dance. We need to learn how to dance with modes. And finally, I wanted to invite you to go to our website, www.imodes.com, and look at our image-based therapy tools. Okay, see you next time.